Hi guys, so we're here for part 2 now. So we're still being the 3-better, so we're going to move into a different scenario. So let's say, for example, we're in the big blind, the small blind is opened, and we've 3-bet them. So let's give the small blind any 2 cards in their range, and we're on the big blind. Let's give ourselves a different hand here. So let's go with a hand like, it's an interesting one. Let's go with a really tough hand. Let's go with King 6 offsuit. Now you might look at King 6 and go, what? Well, technically King 6 is in there. You'd be 3-betting something like maybe 10-15% of the time, maybe slightly less, and wouldn't really be looking to defend as a call. It's not quite strong enough to call, but it's absolutely in there as a bluff some of the time. So they open, we 3-bet, and they call. Okay, so let's give ourselves a different texture this time. There we go. So now we flopped a pair. Villain checks to us, and here we are. So considerations with c-betting or checking, what do we want to do? Well, the nutted side of this board is very good for the big blind because we're going to have hands like, we still got all the strongest hands, right? We still got aces, we got kings, we got queens, we got pocket jacks, and ace jack suited more, ace jack offsuit more of the time because villain's technically supposed to be 4-betting. That's the GTO side of things. In a fundamental micro to low stakes scenario, your opponent's range is going to be rifled with really strong overcards and marginal mixed pairs and some connectors. I think we can most of the time say that villains are going to be jamming queens plus in this spot. They might or might not jam jacks or tens. They might or might not jam ace king. It's a tough one. I would mix here between, again, keeping the game tree really, really simple at the micro stakes and low stakes, and mixing between check, and I would say about half pot here, because a lot of our hands are not going to interact with this board, technically. However, you know, we can keep life easy by betting, right? The only thing that sways me more towards checking with this combo is because, you know, we've got some showdown value here. We beat a hand like ace king, ace queen, ace 10, king queen, pocket fours, you know, and our opponent can make some betting mistakes on turns and rivers, and we can absolutely look to call down or potentially fold depending on what opponent we've got. Betting here and getting raised is a disaster as well, because if it has a hand like 7-8, he has a hand like king queen of diamonds and check raises, this is a disaster because we now have to basically fold, which kind of sucks. I would mostly be rolling this specifically as a check against most villains at the micro and low stakes. So let's say it checks, and we get to the turn, and the turn is what would be a fun one? Let's go with the queen of spades. And let's say our villain now leads. So if our opponent leads here, let's say they lead for about sort of 50%, 60%, something like that. Again, these most micro and low stakes players tend to have this sort of fishy half pot size most of the time. Not to say the half pot's not in there, but that's what they mostly choose. Now, what do we want to do here? So the question is, again, how strong is our hand? Now, we were checking the flop because we assumed our hand was good most of the time, or a decent amount of the time anyway, against a condensed open and defending. It's a 3-bet range. If you're against a tight opponent, I would honestly just consider folding directly, because there's just no scenario on the river that you really like except hitting a king or a 6. Even a king might be bad for you. Hands like reverse implied, like king jack, king queen, for example, ace king, whatever. Okay, we'd have 2 pair, but hitting a 6 is a bit of a miracle and not really enough for us to warrant a call. If we're against an unknown, a loose player, an aggressive player, I would mix this between either calling or raising, because our hand isn't really strong enough to now really just call the turn to call river, right? Our hand is just a trivial mix between call, fold, and raise on the turn. If our opponent bets small, I'm mixing between call and raise. If our opponent bets large, I'm probably just mixing between fold and raise. To be honest, I probably would be calling a large size with this hand. I would prefer to turn it into a bluff blocking king queen, blocking king jack, blocking pocket 6s, etc. 5-6 suited, something like that. If our opponent was to check to us in this scenario, we can absolutely also mix between checking and betting here. Again, betting something. We could probably do most sizes, actually, because this turn is so good for our range that we could probably mix between most sizes. I would probably suggest, again, we're either mixing between check or a small bet, just to keep life easy. So now let's think about being the 4-better. So let's give ourselves another scenario. So let's say, for example, villain opens, let's say MP or hijack, however you want to say it, in a 6 max. They open a decently strong range. we 3-bet the... we have to be the aggressor, don't we? Let's say we open in the MP. We get 3-bet versus the cutoff. And then we 4-bet. So let's give ourselves some different 4-bet scenarios. Let's give ourselves a GTO version first. Let's give ourselves King, Queen suited. Most of the time this hand's going to elect to call, but it is also sometimes going to 4-bet. The reason being that, again, properties of a 4-bet range, we get some direct fold equity, we get power back in the hand, we get to reassert ourselves. It just makes life easy rather than always calling and having to do the whole check, call, check, raise game post-flop. If I was to 4-bet this hand, it would only be for a very specific reason. Like, for example, if I was against a very, very strong opponent at a decent level, then I would be 4-betting it. However, if I was at a micro stakes to low stakes level, as we said in the videos previous, we wouldn't be looking to 4-bet this. So I'm going to give myself a linear 4-bet range, polar 4-bet range of either bluffs and nutted hands. So let's say, for sake of argument, the opponent who 3-bets us, our villain, is a loose, aggressive, spewy reg who sort of 3-bets a bit too wide. He's opening far too wide, but he is folding to a lot of 4-bets, which is something we're looking at. So let's give ourselves a hand like, let's give ourselves King 5 suited. Now this wouldn't usually be in a 4-bet range, basically, but we know as an exploit that our opponent's 3-betting too wide and folding to 4-bets, right? So King 5 suited can absolutely be an exploitative 4-bet bluff, which is powerful. It blocks pocket kings, it blocks King Queen suited, it blocks a hand like Ace King. It's got good properties, right, for those bluffs. So we're going to use that as a 4-bet bluff here. Unfortunately, our opponent calls. So let's move on to a flop. What's a good one? There we go. Let's give ourselves a pretty dry board here. So in 4-bet pots in general, you're going to mostly be looking to pick smaller sizes. Again, between we're not really looking to third as much. We can absolutely do it, but we're mostly focusing on sort of 10% to about 25%. Depending on the texture of the board, say for example, it's very dynamic, we might start to look between having some more third and half sizes as well, even larger potentially. But for the sake of argument, the board is very dry here, and we're MP versus cutoff in a 4-bet situation. Now, in theory, our opponent should technically be protecting his range by sometimes having hands like pocket queens in here, potentially aces, but not as often. But we're still going to basically favour the nutted hands here. His technically nutted hands are supposed to mainly contain, right, King Queen suited, Ace Queen suited, pocket queens, and not really ever deuces, right? Whereas ours are going to contain aces, they're going to contain kings, they're going to contain the King Queen and Ace Queen suited, and then the pocket queens as well. And our opponent should basically be mixing between getting it in and calling with queens as well, whereas we're also mixing. So we have a slightly nutted advantage. But anyway, let's keep things simple. If I'm going to be betting this board, I'm not going to be saying, look, I've got a polarized hand, I'm bluffing, I'm just going to go huge and hope he folds. I would still deviate towards having a small continuation size on the flops and look to fold out hands that are like, again, things like Ace Jack of clubs, Ace 10 of hearts, King Jack of diamonds, things like that. Your opponent's still going to have plenty of combinations of hands that are going to fold. So in terms of c-bet sizing, I would probably suggest more like 25% rather than 10%, because I feel like 10% doesn't really get the job done enough of the time at the lower stakes, and if anything, it might induce some raising. So let's say, for example, we take a 25% sizing and get called. So now let's put a interesting turn card and let's give ourselves the King of Clubs. So this is an interesting spot because we shouldn't really technically get here with King 5 suited. We should have hands sometimes like King 10 suited, right? We should have sometimes hands like King Queen suited rather than, King 5 suited. That's why we don't normally 4-bet it in theory. Now, what I want to have as a note here for you guys is do not now assume that this is just a monster hand. We've now got kings up with a queen. We're beating all the queen X. Let's start fucking sledging and going nuts. Well, let's remind ourselves of what type of range our opponent has. We're really only folding out worse hands if we bet here. So this would actually be a really, really interesting spot and exploitatively a good spot for a check, because your range in that, like, even if, let's give ourselves a few hands that would technically get here as well, so that don't want to feel like I'm just talking out my ass here. Let's go with What's another one that's really good? There we go. So these are a couple of other type of hands that might get here with some 4-bets, right? So we would absolutely 4-bet King 10 suited some of the time. We would absolutely 4-bet queens some of the time. We would also have obviously hands like let's give ourselves Ace King there as well. So hands like Ace King here would absolutely want to mostly be betting the turn because it wants to now get value from King Jack suited, King 10 suited, and sometimes check, right? Hand like Pocket Queens, unblocking the king. So hands like Ace King, for example, hands like King Queen, even though it's blocked, it would mostly be checking here to do some check raising and some check calling, and it would sometimes be betting. Okay, a hand like King 10 suited or King 5 suited, if we find it, which we do in this situation, do really well as protected checks some of the time because this just protects other hands that you have in your range. So for example, you might have a hand like Pocket Jacks, which you again mostly would be checking as flop, but you decided to bet with this time. This just protects you from not having a range on the turn that kind of falls out of its arsehole when, you know, we check the turn and face aggression from our opponent and we cannot call. So for example, our opponent might even merge a hand like Ace Queen, Queen 10, or a pair of 8s, which they sometimes do in weird scenarios in low stakes, where they just bet because you've checked, right? So these types of hands would be pretty decent checks some of the time. You know, King 10 can absolutely bet the turn and get some value from Ace Queen because we're going to be bluffing here as well. In terms of sizings, again, we're very polarized here because we're basically saying we've got King Queen, we're saying we've got Kings and Queens and Aces, we're saying we've got Ace King, and not much else. We would sometimes have had King Jack suited, King 10 suited, but everything else doesn't really want to bet this. So again, we're quite polarized and again looking to mostly go sort of a B60, 66 size. Some over betting, but we need to be careful because our opponent can absolutely have hands like Pocket Queens as well. But we're looking to either be big betting or checking. So if we were to check here with these two marginal hands, or relatively decent marginal hands anyway, and our opponent was to bet, we can now call rather than just having a range that just checks and folds. If we were to check and our opponent checks back, and let's say the river was a brick, we can now absolutely go back for value. You could technically check again for deception and protection, but your villain's just going to check back jacks. Your villain's just going to check back a queen. You're going to look like a bluff here, and this would be a really good spot to go for another big bet on the river. Sometimes bet small, but mostly betting large and doing some overbetting again, potentially even shoving to looking to get value from a hand like Ace Queen, for example, or Pocket Jacks, which may not believe you considering you check the turn. Things like that, just different ways to play the hand. So there's a few different thought processes and a few different options there. So let's move forward again a little bit. And I do appreciate and apologize for the fact that I'm talking a lot, but I'm trying to just talk through these thought processes here. Let's say, for example, that we're opening and facing some 3-bets. Facing some 4-bets, sorry. So now let's give ourselves a scenario where we... what would be a good situation? Let's say the UTG opens. We'll use the early positions because I think they're generally the spots where people struggle more, I think, because there's such stronger ranges in general. Whereas maybe we can get into some other spots later on another video for the post-flop late scenarios. So let's say, for example, our villain opens under the gun. We 3-bet in the hijack. Let's give ourselves King Queen suited, and our opponent 4-bets us. So theoretically, we shouldn't really ever consider folding this. This is a very strong hand, and it would absolutely want to mostly continue one way or another. This would basically just be a call, maybe very small smidge of fold, but mostly calling, because we're just doing okay against a lot of different types of hands. Our villain's supposed to have a couple of bluffs, but your boys probably won't. So we now, if we were doing it from a fundamental GTO scenario, we now need to absolutely think about what is it that our opponent's 4-betting us with in these scenarios. If you think your opponent doesn't really have many 4-bet bluffs, and you're probably right with that assumption, then we should basically just be looking to fold. There's no real reason to have hands like King Queen suited, Ace Jack suited, 10-9 suited, Ace Queen's a bit closer, but we'll give it, and let's go with a hand like Pocket 7s. So these are a couple of hand classes that we may have 3-bet. These are all very, very strong continues and should mostly be continuing against 4-bets most of the time anyway. Excuse me. But at the micro stakes and low stakes, you generally want to be in a situation most of the time to make money where you're the aggressor, whether you're value betting or bluffing, And you don't really want to be in a lot of situations where you're hero calling big raises, calling 4-bets in or out position regardless. Unless you have information that your opponent's very wide or very capable, I would mainly be, again, looking to fold basically all of these combinations. And I know that sounds really, really, really tight, but let's be honest, like, if you're at 2-L up to, say, 15L, and again, this is a disclaimer and I don't want to be subjective, against anyone who's not competent, and that's most of the field, there will be people you should, just play standard and defend most of these against facing 4-bets. But if you were to 3-bet these and face a 4-bet by most of the population who are tight or recreational, none of these hands do very well against your opponent's perceived range, whether that be hands like jacks plus ace king, ace queen suited, maybe pocket tens most of the time anyway, whether they have bluffs or not regardless, because you're just going to be crushed by their ranges. The only reason you would be 3-betting and calling these to a 4-bet is if you feel like your opponent has enough of those hands that aren't just absolutely death nutted, like those nutted hands, aces, kings, etc. So for example, if you're a 25 or 50 reg and you're against some of the, but there are a few of them in there, I would think, that are strong enough to have 4-bet bluffs, very rarely, you need to be careful with how much you're folding, right? But against most of the population, especially the weaker, tighter regs and the nits and the fish and the balls, these are not strong enough to continue, even though a GTO scenario would put you in a lot of defense. Remember, you're supposed to be defending range. You're supposed to have quite strong defense against 4-bets and 3-bets, because your villain is supposed to be strong enough to have them as 3-bet and 4-bet bluffs and an aggressive range, right? But if your villain doesn't have them, then you have no reason to be correctly defending against 4-bets, okay? So that's a bit of a disclaimer. For the sake of argument, we're going to say we're playing a 15L hand and we've got a competent opponent who we've 3-bet most of the time with one of these hand combos, at face to 4-bet and then defended. So let's keep all of these hands in there, okay? If I was playing 2L to 25 now, I probably would have just folded by now, honestly, and moved on. Or, again, as we spoke about in the previous videos, we wouldn't probably have 3-bet any of these most of the time, because we would have preferred to have just linearly called in position, most of them anyway, and just play post flop, right? We're not worried about not 3-betting enough. We're not worried about anything at all. We just basically need to play the hand as easy as possible. So these hands would all constitute a very strong call. Keep your villain's range as wide as possible and just play post flop in position. Perfect, right? 3-betting all of these and getting 4-bet is a disaster at micro stakes and low stakes. It's unfortunate, right? Because you need to be playing more aggressive. But honestly, I would rather bluff with a hand like King 5 suited, King 6 suited, Ace 7 suited, King 9 suited. And if I get 4-bet or called, well, fine. I know I can pitch, or I know I can blast some certain textures on post-flop streets and go from there. If you're playing NL 500, NL 200 against top regs and above, you have to play these as defense, right? One way or another, but you're not, right? This is for micro stakes and low stakes. Even mid stakes, to be honest. You need to be careful with how you combat 3-betting and then being 4-bet, and you need to be very, very cautious about what types of ranges you give your opponents, because unfortunately, most of the time, be it a subjective opinion, your ranges that are just going to be crushed. They're just going to be absolutely crushed. So anyway, moving forward for the sake of argument, we're at 15L, which is the top of that sort of low stake spectrum for the video. We're against, let's say, a competent opponent who has 4-bet bluffs and a correct 3-bet, 4-bet, 5-bet range. For the sake of argument, they are very good. They're a strong opponent. This is how we're going to continue. So let's say, for example, they opened under the gun, we 3-bet in the hijack, we have any one of these combinations, and we face a 4-bet. Most of these are just going to be calls. King Queen suited, Ace Jack suited, and Ace Queen suited are basically all going to be, most of the time, just playing as calls, because they play well, especially in position in 4-bet pots. And like pocket 7s will mix, because again, we shouldn't really be 3-betting it pure anyway in the first place. We can mix between fold and call. In a hand like 10-9 suited, again, most of the time folds and will sometimes call. You could argue as well that some of these hands would also constitute a 5-bet bluff, but that's way too far-fetched for micro stakes to low stakes. So, these are all our hand classes, because this is the last part of the video that we're going to be talking about, and then we're going to be done. Let's give ourselves some different board textures. So, we 3-bet and got 4-bet in early positions. Here we are. Let's give ourselves... what kind of board do we want? Let's give ourselves a low texture first. Let's go with 3-3. 10. So let's just say, for the sake of argument, that our opponent looks at this board texture and says, right, well, they've identified that in a low paired board with the 10. Generally, they're looking to do a mix between small sizes and roughly half pot, mostly favouring the small size, especially in a 4-bet scenario in early positions. And they've bet somewhere between sort of 25 and 33%. Here we are. So now we've got hands like King, Queen, and Ace Jack suited with no backdoor flush draw. These would sometimes raise as bluffs because they have really good removal. They are blocking some of our opponent's range, both for value and bluffs. So, for example, King Queen suited blocks hands like pocket kings and pocket queens, which is really, really good. It blocks. It does unfortunately also block hands like Ace Queen and Ace King, but that's just the trade-off. Don't always force yourself to pure fold because you've 3-bet, got 4-bet, and called. He missed the board, so right, well, we're done. If your opponent is strong enough to have 4-bet bluffs, or just is strong enough in general to just be in this situation without just having, say, aces or kings or queens or whatever, you need to start considering having some flop or maybe turn check raises some of the time to put pressure on your opponent and not allow them to just bet and just win the pot whenever they want and force you to have something good in order to continue. Generally, you'd prefer to have a backdoor flush draw, but the removal of King, Queen, and Ace Jack is quite strong where you can sometimes turn these into bluffs on the flop and then mostly give up turns and rivers and sometimes bluff. Hands like 10-9 suited, for example, just say for the sake of argument, we got here with this. This is where you need to be careful because it's not just a trivial call. I mean, in a GTO scenario, you're always calling because you flop top pair. You can sometimes just raise, but you're mostly just calling. You need to be in a kind of mindset where you're saying to yourself, if your opponent has bluffs, you need to kind of say, right, look, how far am I going to go with this? Am I going to fold the flop directly? Am I going to call? Am I going to call the turn? Am I going to fold the river? What am I going to do? You need to make an assumption now before you even call the flop bet towards what type of opponent you've got here against. This doesn't really constitute smashing the board because most of his range is still going to be over pairs and over cards most of the time, right? So even if he's bluffing a hand like Ace King, Ace Queen, King Queen, you're still dodging equity, right? You're still dodging cards and you can still be put under pressure on turn rivers. So you need to make a decision now whether you're going to call and call down or whether you're going to potentially fold the turns or rivers depending on what scenario, what cards come out. If you're against a bit of an aggro tard, like a really aggressive player, I probably would just consider calling down if you got here because you've put a lot of money in at this point and folding without any scare cards on the turn or river potentially would be a bit of a spot where it's like, we put a lot of money and don't really want to get away. If you get turn cards, so for example, we've still got the 10-9 suited here, bear with me, and turns like the ace or the king come on the turn and river, it now becomes a trivial hand where your hand just becomes basically a pure bluff catch and mostly a fold. Whereas when the turn and river textures don't really change and you feel like your opponent over bluffs and doesn't really get here with as much value as you think they're supposed to, you can potentially look to call down. But remember, guys, these types of scenarios are not really what we're looking for. We're looking to be 3-bet bluffing with those polar hands and polar 3-bet betting for value and mostly being in value spots. We're looking for situations where we're 3-betting and putting pressure on people. We're not really looking to be at scenarios where we're just calling people down and hoping that they're bluffing, especially at micro stakes and low stakes because they just don't really have enough bluffs. Like they just don't, right? So I would really, really, really heavily consider just mostly folding to 4-bets and having more of these types of hand classes that continue as calls rather than 3-bets and have to face 4-bets and potentially fold or call. So that's a lot of information to take over a 2-part spread video series there. We're going to do some videos in the future where we specifically focus on certain spots. So for example, just like blind on blind single raise, UTG versus big blind 3-bet, etc. And we're going to go into more detail. This was just a bit of a follow-on from one of the previous videos where we were talking about some of the post-op situations. So I've blabbed a lot and I hope you've managed to keep up with me. But please like and subscribe and leave comments. If you feel like I'm kind of blabbing and kind of talking out my arsehole a bit, let me know and I'll try and mix up the videos a little bit, maybe make them a bit more interactive. If you feel like the content's good and very helpful, please let me know because it's really, really good for me moving forward and helping you guys out with the content moving forward. Anyway, I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks a lot. Goodbye.